James Waterhouse there in Kyiv. There'll be much more on that Arab League summit and the G7 coming up with Matthew for you at the top of the hour. Stay with us on BBC News.
You experienced racism. Why didn't you walk away?
That's a really good question.
You're a politician.
I'm not a politician. I don't read the polls.
Yeah,
I sit in Judiciary Committee. No,
you are very definitely a politician.
No.
The very fact that there were not people who looked like you.
Hold on. I'm only halfway through my answer.
Is secret schooling happening across Afghanistan for girls?
It does.
You simply can't assume that.
Actually, yes, you can.
Hard Talk. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Two summits dominated by the future of Ukraine. President Zelensky arrives in Jeddah to appeal for Arab support.
Unfortunately, there are some in the world and here among you who turn a blind eye to those cages and illegal annexations.
Syria's President Assad is invited to that Arab League gathering. We'll assess the significance of that after a decade of brutal civil war. Meanwhile, G7 leaders in Japan announced new sanctions against Moscow. We'll have all the latest. Tesco boss John Allen quits following allegations of inappropriate behaviour by 4 women. And coming up in the next hour, NASA will announce more about their latest expedition to the moon. Hello and welcome to BBC News. It is a day of two important summits, with the war in Ukraine being the common theme. At the G7 gathering in Japan, world leaders met to discuss a new round of sanctions against Russia, whilst at the Arab League meeting in Saudi Arabia, President Zelensky made a surprise visit, urging those attending to support Ukraine. Well, he told the gathering in Jeddah that on this, the 450th day of the war, the world needed to fight the virus of aggression from Moscow, stressing Kyiv would not give up any sovereign territory to achieve peace. But also making the headlines today at that summit, President Assad of Syria, the first time he's been invited to the Arab League since the devastating civil war that's blighted that country. Well, here he is, the official handshake and welcome from the Saudi Crown Prince. Well, more on Assad in a moment, more on the G7 as well. First, though, let's hear from Volodymyr Zelensky. Well, more from both of those summits coming up around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News. Well, let's turn to a few other stories here in the UK making the headlines. Let's start in Northern Ireland because voting has begun, or the counting has begun in the council elections, and it's expected to take at least 2 days. All of the 462 seats are being contested. Polls have suggested Sinn Féin may overtake the Democratic Unionists to become the biggest party in local government for the first time. Nationwide has announced a 40% jump in profits for the 12 months to April. The company's chief executive says the strong performance meant some customer accounts would be receiving payments of £100. And finally, the government is setting out a £1 billion strategy to try to boost the semiconductor industry in the UK. The investment over the next 10 years is designed to focus on chip design and development rather than manufacture. Well, those some of the stories, and we'll have more on that semiconductor package here on BBC News in this programme in the next little while. Well, you're live with BBC News. Let's turn to a story that's been breaking in the last hour or so. The chairman of the UK's biggest supermarket chain, Tesco, is to step down from his role next month. The company says allegations over John Allen's personal conduct risk becoming a distraction to the supermarket. Mr. Allen has faced 4 allegations in the media in relation to his personal conduct, 3 of which he vigorously denies. He has unreservedly apologised for inappropriate comments he made to a female member of staff. Well, let's get more on this. Let's speak to my colleague Mark Ashdown, who's there in the newsroom. And Mark, just give us the latest and tell us a little more about what is behind all of this.
Human landing system to dock with that and then take the astronauts down to the moon. So they really want a sort of sustainable lunar economy.
Kate, we have to leave it there because, as you can hear, the music is playing. That means we've got a break coming up. We'll be live to hear a little more from that NASA news conference in just a moment or two. We'll have more headlines here in just a moment. Do take it away.
People are travelling again, heading back out on the road and rediscovering their wanderlust.
Exploring new destinations and cultures, making fresh friends, and creating memories that will last a lifetime.
That's why at the Travel Show, we're expanding our horizons too. And wherever we go,
we want you to come with us. Now that might make for an awful lot of excess baggage, but we think you're worth it.
The Travel Show. Watch now on BBC iPlayer.
This is BBC News. Our main headlines here. 2 summits dominated by the future of Ukraine. President Zelensky arrives in Jeddah to appeal for Arab support. Also invited to the Arab League gathering, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad spoke of an historic opportunity to address issues in the Middle East without foreign interference. Meanwhile, G7 leaders in Japan announced new sanctions against Moscow. We'll have more from those summits. Well, more from those summits. We're also keeping an eye on that NASA news conference. It's due to get underway in the next couple of minutes, so we'll bring you the key bits from that. But that gives us a chance to squeeze in a little sport. So let's head to the Sports Centre and join Gavin. And what do you have for us, Gavin, this afternoon?
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Matthew. We'll start with the golf, and Bryson DeChambeau is the man to catch at the US PGA Championship, as several big names have work ahead of them on the second round at Oak Hill. World number 1, Jon Rahm, is in a battle to stay in contention. Rahm's back on 6 over and not out again until later on today. Adam Scott, Michael Block, Dustin Johnson and Justin Rose as well there pushing for the lead. They're on 3 under. And Rory McIlroy begins his second round on 1 over as well. Promises to be explosive indeed. That is all the sport from us for now, Matthew. We'll be back with more later on. We'll see you then.
See you then, Gavin. Thanks very much. We're going to turn straight to breaking news here in the UK. A distressing story because news from the police that a 37-year-old man has died after being attacked by a dog. The victim was found, say officers in Lee in Greater Manchester, with serious injuries shortly after 9 o'clock on Thursday, taken to hospital, but news of his death in the early hours of Friday. Now, Greater Manchester Police said armed officers were deployed to try to control the dog and used every available tactic to subdue the animal before it was destroyed because it posed, quote, a significant risk to the public. A 24-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of being in charge of a dangerously out-of-control dog causing injury resulting in death. So just to confirm what we're hearing from police in the city of Manchester, a 37-year-old man has died after being attacked by a dog. Those just some of the early details. When there is more, we'll obviously return to that. Now, we were telling you a little while ago about that NASA news conference, some of the details about how they plan to organise the landing vehicle for that trip to the moon. Some of the details we are going to learn in the next little while. So let's cross. They're all ready to go. So that Artemis landing system announcement, you can see it there in the backdrop. So let's put the microphones up. I think the early introductions just being made. And in fact, as I say that, the first of the key speakers. So let's put the microphones up and hear some of the some go to Gateway. Well, there we're going to come away having heard some of the headlines there, or we heard from NASA talking about the golden age of space flights. We knew their work with SpaceX, but details of the latest in terms of who builds the landing part of their next moon mission. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin team, together with Lockheed Martin, Boeing, they are the ones to win this NASA contract. And of course, in terms of the Artemis 2 mission, we heard heard the NASA chief say every day he asks in terms of how we're doing, and the answer he gets back, we're on track for the fall of 2024. So let's bring in Kate Arkless-Gray again, who was listening to all of that. We talked to her before we heard from NASA. What did you make of the details that we heard there? Because they talked there about having worked through the Starship, the rockets. Now we're getting to the lander itself.
Yeah, and see how we get, if we can have a sustainable thing on the moon.
The progress is swift. We have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us here on the programme to take us through all of that. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Let's go straight to breaking news, because it's being reported by the AFP news agency that Russia says it has put the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan on, quote, a wanted list. Now, of course, we knew that Russia was investigating the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. They'd opened that case against him and other ICC judges back in March, but certainly upping of the ante to put Karim Khan on a wanted list. Of course, the ICC looking to bring a case against Vladimir Putin himself and other key players there in Moscow for the overseeing of the abduction of children from Ukraine and taking them to Russia, as well as crimes against humanity. Russia not a signatory to the ICC, but that has gone back and forth between Moscow and the ICC over the last few months. The latest with Russia saying they've put the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan on a wanted list. That news being reported by the AFP. Whether it's in terms of timing comes as the West again looks at more sanctions against Moscow, we don't know. But we'll keep an eye on that. If there is more, we'll obviously return to it. Well, we're back with more of today's headlines here on the programme in a moment or two. Don't go away.
Are you a raver?
Do I look like a raver?
I've got bass in a backpack. This is amazing.
Dancing for like 4 or 5 hours of a gig, you could generate about 800 kilowatt hours of thermal energy. So that's a lot of energy.
Right, so shall we give it a taste then? It's my favourite.
We're really talking to the plants and they're telling us how happy they are.
It can fly, but it can also float on water.
The bots kick off with some swift striking.
Oh my God, that went by quick. It's all about augmented reality.
Useful, then. It's useful.
I scroll through the options with my finger here. Solar system, let's give that one a go. Totally and utterly immersed in another world there.
We've got to consider all of these things if we're going to avoid an apocalyptic fate. But also excited.
The police have found us. I can't believe I'm now wanting to run away from the police. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Your Tech Update. Click, watch on BBC iPlayer.
Live from London, this is BBC News. 2 summits dominated by the future of Ukraine. President Zelensky arrives in Jeddah to appeal for Arab support.
Unfortunately, there are some in the world and here among you who turn a blind eye to those cages and illegal annexations.
Syria's President Assad is invited to that Arab League gathering. We'll assess the significance of that after a decade of brutal civil war. Meanwhile, G7 leaders in Japan announce new sanctions against Moscow. We'll have all the latest. John Allen quits as chairman of the UK's biggest supermarket chain, Tesco, following allegations of inappropriate behaviour made by 4 women. Welcome to BBC News. It is a day of 2 important summits, with the war in Ukraine being the common theme. Well, at the G7 gathering in Japan, world leaders met to discuss a new round of sanctions against Russia, whilst at the Arab League meeting in Saudi Arabia, President Zelensky made a surprise visit, urging those attending to support Ukraine. He told the gathering in Jeddah that on this, the 450th day of the war, the world needed to fight the virus of aggression from Moscow, stressing that Kyiv would not give up any sovereign territory to achieve peace. Well, also making the headlines at that summit, President Assad of Syria, the first time he's been invited to the Arab League since the devastating civil war that's blighted his country. Here he is, the official handshakes and welcome from Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince. Well, more on Assad in a moment or two, more too from the G7. First, though, let's hear from Volodymyr Zelensky. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Now let's stay with a few more stories making the headlines here in the UK, because vote counting has begun in Northern Ireland's council elections and is expected to take at least 2 days to complete. All of the 462 seats are being contested. Polls have suggested Sinn Féin might overtake the Democratic Unionists to become the biggest party in local government for the first time. Nationwide has announced a 40% jump in profits for the 12 months to April. The company's chief executive says the strong performance meant customers' accounts would be receiving payments of £100. And the government is setting out a £1 billion strategy to try to boost the semiconductor industry in the UK. The investment over the next 10 years is designed to focus on chip design and development rather than manufacture. And that announcement made a little earlier will have more reaction to that story here in the next hour on BBC News. Well, you're live with BBC News. Let's return to the situation in Ukraine, because parts of the country, including the capital, Kyiv, have again been targeted by Russian drones and missile attacks. It comes as officials say they're preparing for about half the population to need mental health support as a result of Russia's invasion last year. The country's health system, well, that is already under strain, with doctors having to prioritise patients with physical injuries. Here's our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, out of Kyiv. Phil Mutter reporting there from Sydney. We're back with headlines here in just a minute or two. Don't go away.
When the weather can't make up its mind, we can help you make up yours. Check on the BBC Weather app.
You're watching BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. 2 summits dominated by the future of Ukraine. President Zelensky arrives in Jeddah to appeal for Arab support.
Unfortunately, there are some in the world and here among you who turn a blind eye to those cages and illegal annexations.
Syria's President Assad is invited to that Arab League gathering. We'll assess the significance of that after a decade of brutal civil war. The clean-up after devastating floods in northern Italy continues, leaving 14 people dead and forcing thousands from their homes. We'll be live on that story here in just a moment or two. Well, before all of that, let's head to the BBC Sports Centre, round up the sport of the day, and Gavin is back.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Matthew. We'll start with the latest from the... we'll go to the latest from the golf in a moment. But first, some breaking news from the Welsh rugby camp. Alan Wynne-Jones, the world's most capped international player, has joined teammate Justin Tipuric in retiring from the international game. Sure, it will be a special fight indeed. That is all the sport from us for now, Matthew. More on that breaking story of Alan Wynne-Jones retiring from international rugby on the BBC Sport website, as well as the latest on the golf as well. We'll see you soon.
Kevin, see you soon. Thanks very much. Now, let's return very much to our main stories. We've, of course, had those twin summits going on through the course of the day. Let's concentrate on that for the next few minutes, because the leaders of the G7 group of developed economies completed their first day of the summit in Japan, focusing on extending sanctions against Russia and more support for Ukraine. The statement said the measures would starve Moscow of resources needed to prosecute its war against Kyiv. They also made sure Ukraine has sufficient funds into next year. As you can see from the pictures, they're meeting there in Hiroshima. The G7 leaders called Moscow's plans to station nuclear weapons in Belarus reckless. Christine, we have to leave it there, but great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us live from Washington. Well, let's stay in the US, because in New York, a funeral is taking place for Jordan Neely. Now, you may remember he was the homeless man who was killed on a subway train. The veteran civil rights leader, the Reverend Al Sharpton, delivering his eulogy at that funeral in a church in Harlem. Let's just put the sound up.
You see our children.
Neda Tawfik there in New York. Thanks very much. Thank you. Now, if you've been watching the programme over the last few days, you'll have seen us covering the heavy floods that have been going on in northern Italy over the last few days, where at least 14 people have died and 13,000 have now been evacuated from their homes. Well, the clean-up and rescue efforts are still going on in the Emilia-Romagna region, which remains on red alert after 6 months' worth of rainfall fell in just a day and a half. Well, over 20 rivers have burst their banks and about 40 towns have been inundated. Well, let's speak now to Natalie Zavaroni, who's in a small town in Emilia-Romagna, which has been so heavily affected. Thank you so much for being here with us. Why don't you start by just trying to describe for us the sorts of scenes that are happening all around you? Natalie, I'll come back in a moment or two, but we're just going to say goodbye to our viewers here around the world on BBC News. Well, Natalie, sorry to interrupt you mid-flow, but we continue to watch the pictures, and you talked about the amount of rivers that have burst their banks. You've talked about just the huge number of landslides. But in terms of what we've had from government, a lot of pressure on the Italian government to come up with a new plan that takes on board that Italy is actually seeing much more of these extreme weather events. Does it feel like there may be movement? Scott, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. Scott White there, talking to us from Durham, the Executive Director of Pragmatic Semiconductors, and we're going to have more on that story here on the programme in the next 20-25 minutes. We're going to pause though first, catch up with all the weather details of the day, and that's with Ben Rich.
Hello. Some parts of England and Wales had some hefty downpours to contend with, patchy cloud and sunny spells, and while there won't be a heat wave, it'll feel pleasant in the sunshine.
People are going to the polls to vote in local elections across Northern Ireland. As the results come through, BBC News will bring you in-depth coverage, reporting and analysing the outcome of your vote. Elections 23, today on BBC News. Watch on iPlayer.
This is BBC News. In the next 60 minutes, all the main UK stories together with the latest breaking developments internationally. 2 summits dominated by the future of Ukraine. President Zelensky arrives in Jeddah to appeal for Arab support.
Unfortunately, there are some in the world and here among you who turn a blind eye to those cages and illegal annexations.
Syria's President Assad is invited to that Arab League gathering. We'll assess the significance of that after a decade of brutal civil war. Meanwhile, G7 leaders in Japan announced new sanctions against Moscow. In In our other headlines, John Allen quits as chairman of the UK's biggest supermarket, Tesco, following allegations of inappropriate behaviour from 4 women. And West Ham qualify for the final of the Europa League, but violent clashes in the stands mars the end of the match. Hello and welcome to BBC News. It is a day of 2 really important summits, with the war in Ukraine being the common theme. At the G7 gathering in Japan, world leaders met to discuss a new round of sanctions against Russia, while at the Arab League meeting in Saudi Arabia, President Zelensky made a surprise visit, urging those attending to support Ukraine. Well, he told the gathering in Jeddah that on this, the 450th day of the war, the world needed to fight the virus of aggression from Moscow, stressing Kyiv would not give up any sovereign territory to achieve peace. Well, also making the headlines at that summit, the President Assad of Syria, the first time he's been invited to the Arab League since the devastating civil war that's blighted the country and the region. Well, here he is, the official handshakes and welcomes from the Saudi Crown Prince. More on Assad in a moment, more too from the G7. First, though, let's hear from Volodymyr Zelensky. Tom, thanks for being so brief and thanks for joining us here on the programme.
My pleasure.
Well, around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News. Let's turn to a couple of stories also making the headlines here in the UK, because vote counting has begun in Northern Ireland's council elections and is expected to take at least a couple of days. All of the 462 seats are being contested. Polls have suggested Sinn Féin may overtake the Democratic Unionists to become the biggest party in local government for the first time. 2 men have been arrested over the attempted murder of a senior police officer in Northern Ireland earlier this year. The pair, aged 28 and 70, were arrested following separate searches in County Tyrone. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot in Omagh in February. He'd been putting footballs in a car with his young son after coaching a youth sports team when he was targeted. And Nationwide has announced a 40% jump in profits for the 12 months to April. The company's chief executive says the strong performance meant some customers would be receiving payments of £100 into their accounts. Well, you're live with BBC News. Now let's return to that breaking news the last hour or so here in the UK. And it comes from Greater Manchester Police, who say a 37-year-old man has died after injury sustained in a dog attack. The man was found by officers in Lee near Wigan with serious injuries on Thursday evening. He was taken to hospital where he has died earlier today. Police said armed officers were deployed to try to control the dog and said they used every available tactic to subdue the animal before it was destroyed. A 24-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of being in charge of a dangerously out-of-control dog, causing injury resulting in death. Darren Jones, we have to leave it there, but as you rightly identify, this is a subject, an area that so many governments in Western capitals having to address. Thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News. We'll have to leave it there. Well, we'll have more of the day's headlines here in just a moment or two. Don't go away.
Want to understand what the news means for you? BBC News Catch Up on Sounds is a new playlist that puts you in control and lets you explore the stories you're interested in. From breaking headlines...
There's been a wave of missile strikes across Ukraine.
...to deep dive podcasts and current analysis.
The longer the conflict goes on, the more chance there is just something happening that leads to an escalation.
Make sense of the stories you care about whenever suits you. Open the BBC Sounds app, tap podcasts for News Catch Up.
This is BBC News. Our main headlines here. 2 summits dominated by the future of Ukraine. President Zelensky arrives in Jeddah to appeal for Arab support.
Unfortunately, there are some in the world and here among you who turn a blind eye to those cages and illegal annexations.
Also at the Arab League gathering, Syria's President Assad, who spoke of an historic opportunity to address issues in the Middle East without foreign interference. Meanwhile, G7 leaders in Japan announced new sanctions against Moscow. Here, West Ham qualify for the final of the Europa League, but violent clashes mar the end of the match. And one other headline, belief in a God plummets in the UK. We'll speak to the author of a new report that's out today. But let's start this half hour with a different story, because the brother of the TV presenter Philip Schofield has been sentenced to 12 years in prison for sexually abusing a teenage boy. 54-year-old Timothy Schofield was found guilty of 11 offences last month. Jenny Kumar reports now from Exeter in the southwest. Now, a 21-year-old man from Brighton has admitted plotting a gun attack in London's Hyde Park. Edward Little planned to buy a gun to kill a Christian preacher at Speaker's Corner. He was on his way to London in a taxi with thousands of pounds in cash when he was stopped and arrested last September. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford. Daniel Sanford at the Old Bailey. Now, in New York, a funeral has been held for Jordan Neely, a 30-year-old homeless man who was killed on the subway earlier this month. Mr. Neely died after a former Marine who was also on the subway put him in a chokehold and pinned him to the ground. Witnesses say Mr. Neely had been shouting at passengers and asking for money, but according to police, there was no evidence he'd attacked anyone. Well, the man responsible for Neely's death has been charged with manslaughter. A small crowd of mourners gathered today at a church in Harlem to remember Mr. Neely. The Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy. Now let's turn to a fascinating story. It is the UK's changing attitudes towards religion, because new global data suggests that Britons are the least likely nationality to identify as religious, following a long-term decline in faith since the 1980s. The research led by the Policy Institute at King's College London also found that the share of the UK population who say God is not important in their lives is at a record high. While the belief in heaven has decreased in the last 4 decades, the idea of life after death and hell has remained stable, with younger generations more inclined to believe in both, despite being less religious in general. Well, let's talk to one of the authors of the report, Professor Bobby Duffy, director of that Policy Institute. Bobby, thank you so much for being here on the programme. That is actually fascinating in terms of the numbers in decline. Over what sort of period? Professor Duffy, we have to leave it there, but it's fascinating, this whole subject, and I'm glad you've come on and talked to us about it today on BBC News. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now let's turn to football and those events we saw last night, the disturbing events, because West Ham, well, they are celebrating after qualifying for the final of the Europa Conference League. They beat AZ Alkmaar by 3-1 on aggregate, but the victory was marred by those ugly scenes at the end of the match. These just some of the pictures. It seems that some of the Dutch supporters attacked an area in which the West Ham players' friends and family were actually watching that match. Well, let's get more on this. The West Ham supporter Russell Raphael was at the game with his son and witnessed the scenes. Let's head to the BBC Sports Centre. Let's talk to our correspondent Andy Swiss. And Andy, those scenes were pretty disturbing in part last night, but as David Moyes just reflecting, it takes the edge off what was a great night for West Ham. Yes, UEFA won't want any sort of repetition of what we saw in the last 24 hours. Andy Swiss there, thanks very much for all of that. Thank you. Now, sewage being leaked into waterways has become a health threat for those who enjoy open water swimming. Yesterday, of course, water companies in England apologised for releasing contaminated water into rivers and seas and announced plans to upgrade the network. Well, one way to keep swimmers safe is to have designated bathing areas which are frequently tested for sewage pollution. Here's our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt. He sent this report from one of those areas affected, and that's Plymouth. Now, one more story to bring you because Jordan Pilkington is in his early 20s. He's one of the youngest people in the UK to have motor neurone disease. He's also an avid fan of Manchester United, and his visit there had a special surprise in store. John Watson has the story. Jordan Pilkington ending that report from John Watson. Lewis is here next. That's it from me. Hopefully I'll see you at the same time tomorrow. Bye for now.